South Carolina.
Hey, we're going.
Hey-ho.
Hello.
Hey, we're live. Hey, welcome. Calling Chris Anderson. Where are you, Chris? You've moved. You're on the move. Are you in the undisclosed location?
The secret bunker.
Well,
no, I'm back in the Donington Valley on the Band of Brothers tour. So we're just outside of Newbury, and just started the latest tour, and I'm in my hotel room again.
There you
and
go.
You look like you're still in Chicago.
I am here in Chicago. Chris and
I.
Welcome to everyone. History Happy Hour brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris and I do travel the globe, but we try to reserve this time every week for a cocktail and a chance to talk history with you. And today our topic is, I think he's the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman. Chris, before we start, though, did I hear correctly that Scotland did not make the World Cup this year? And that the United States did?
Well, you're getting kind of off on the wrong foot on this whole
I just was kind of thought I'm just amazed that you're still going, that you're still able to carry on.
Well, that's because Arsenal crushed Tottenham, so I'm
okay.
that
great respect for your ability to carry on in the face of this terrible crisis. Yeah,
I appreciate that.
By the way, now that I have severed my relationship with Chris Anderson,
thank you.
I want to say a big thank you to everyone for supporting this effort via Patreon, especially our top shelf supporters seen here. We still have that uneven line there. We're still waiting for one more person to fill that up, so maybe that can happen. And Chris, do we have an audience out there? Who's watching us?
I do. Well, Neil Shara has joined us. Ken from Kansas, Xavier. So we have our international contingent. Helen Lukash from Metro West Boston, so hometown girl, you like that. And David Picker from Philadelphia. Stephen Kraft from Delaware. So
lots of people. I see Doug McCord. I see Frank and Wally. So we got a good group of people who are interested in Harry Truman. Maybe we should move on to do the actual show. What do you think?
There you go. I think it's a good idea. Ready? All right.
Give it to me.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. What do you have today for a drink, Chris?
I have a Camden Pale Ale.
Oh, nice.
Nice. Local.
I have a Balvenie Scotch in an Aaron Burr shot glass. I'm not sure what message I'm sending.
You were trying to recover and then dived again.
I know. But we probably should be drinking bourbon and branch water. If anyone could tell me what branch water is.
I'm kind of disappointed you have to ask.
Yeah, because that was the preferred drink, I think, of the man who is the subject of today's show, Harry Truman. And Truman, of course, became president upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945, April of 1945. And his presidency was a tumultuous period marked by the victories of our war against Germany and Japan, the first use of an atomic bomb, the beginning of the Cold War and the Korean War. And Truman has been mythologized as the plainspoken man from Missouri who won the day with common sense wisdom. And I think our guest today is a little bit less interested in the myth and a little bit more interested in the man. So Jeffrey Frank has written a new and highly praised biography of Truman entitled The Trials of Harry Truman, The Extraordinary Presidency of an Ordinary Man, 1945 to 1953. And Jeffrey Frank was a senior editor at The New Yorker, the deputy editor of the Washington Post's Outlook section, and is the author of the book Ike and Dick. So, Jeffrey Frank, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Well, it's very good to be here.
What is branch water anyway?
I was just about to tell you. Branch water, in one telling, it sort of came out of the tap of John Nance Garner's washroom. It was water.
Sounds very exotic.
It was water.
It was mythologized water.
Well, good. How appropriate that a mythologized figure should drink mythologized water. Jeffrey, you write that Harry Truman was a complicated man concealed behind a mask of down-home forthrightness. I don't think we kind of remember him as being complicated. So what makes him complicated, and what makes him an interesting figure for a biographer such as yourself?
Well, he was complicated because he managed to sort of hide himself behind this mask of the Missouri, the farm boy who was never who was never called upon to say anything very sophisticated, but in fact was a very sophisticated man. He studied history, and he knew what was going on. He knew what was going on, and he was a really good student. He was a student of the world even after he became president. He studied and studied, and even though he was unprepared for the job, he took it very seriously and took himself very seriously and took his responsibilities very seriously. And he agonized over the job. That was, if he wasn't just this simple guy who woke up and said, I can do this. He actually was almost sick at heart when he first had to face responsibilities. For example, even his first trip to Potsdam, where he was going to meet Churchill and Stalin, who he met Churchill, said hello to him when Churchill visited Washington before then, but he had obviously never met Stalin. And these were two world historical figures. These are the men who had seen their countries through the most horrific war in history. And here's Truman, this novice, this Missouri senator, who had been vice president for 3 months before he became president.
So Jeffrey, speaking towards this kind of image that we have of Truman, do you think that did he believe that he was a simple man from Missouri, or did he deliberately put on this, I don't want to say act, that's too strong a word, but did he kind of play the character, or did part of him believe that this is who he was?
No, I think he didn't see himself as a simple man. I think there were sort of two Trumans. The post-presidential Truman. Then he began to play the part. He would say things like there were three figures from Missouri: Jesse James, Mark Twain, and me, and things like that. And he became the Harry Truman that we all try to remember, the one who says, I'll give him hell. They'll know what hell is. But the Truman who became president was. He was a man who thought a lot about his job and took it very, very seriously, and knew that he wasn't ready, but was determined to become ready for it. And he hurried up to do so. And he really had to make some, as you say, he had to make some big decisions. Some of them were already made for him. There was nothing he could do. For example, the atom bomb. That was no way. That was going to be. He was the one who said we're going to use it, but he wasn't the one who made the decision that we were going to use it.
I guess what you're saying there is that with the atom bomb, which of course is the very first big decision that presents itself, is that it kind of was it was preordained that we weren't going to spend several $1 billion and develop this huge weapon system and then go, we'll leave it on the shelf and invade Japan.
Yes, Truman gave the order. But people like Jimmy Byrne and James Francis Burns was as concerned that the political cost, if this thing had been a dud and they spent a couple of $1 billion and it didn't work, that was an issue too. But Truman gave the order. But his real big decision was not to bomb Kyoto, which was originally the first city on the target list. The idea being that would really demoralize the Japanese, and he was basically told, if we do that, they'll never forgive us.
Chris, can I jump in with one more, or do you want to? No, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Ahead. Sure. No,
you can go.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that sometimes, I know I assume that people know a little bit more about this scenario, but could you just briefly, to bring everybody up to speed, talk about just how unprepared he is when he becomes president, and what is he thrust into, and what is he kind of confronted with?
Yeah, well, as Rick was saying, he had to end two wars that were going on. The war in Europe ended on May. He became president on April 12th. The war in Europe ended on May 8th when Germany surrendered. And then the war in Japan was certainly going to be won, but then there was a question: how quickly could it be won? We tested this bomb. This bomb but in April, Truman didn't know about it until. By the way, I should go back. Truman was not even told about this thing we had. This atomic.
As vice president, he didn't even know about it.
Roosevelt had never told him, and Truman was so out of it that soon after Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1945, and Truman was inaugurated as vice president, Roosevelt left right away. He went to the Crimea, to Yalta, to meet with Stalin and Churchill, and then they sort of working out the last questions about the settlement of the war, none of which was really settled. The big question then was what to do with Poland, and that was an unsettled question. Roosevelt comes back. He comes back on April 29th and gives a speech that he can barely. He's so tired he has to stand up. He's, for the first time, he acknowledges that he has to use braces, and he sits down to deliver the speech. Then he leaves. For for Georgia, where he dies on April 12th. I'm sorry. And then before he left for Crimea, he actually told Truman in a memo, "If you need to reach me, use the diplomatic pouch. Basically, don't bother me. I'm going to be too busy to talk to you." And that was the last communication between Truman and, as I can see, between Truman and Roosevelt was in late March, when Truman basically wanted some patronage. He wanted to give his friend Bob Hannigan, who had been a big help to him in the 1930s when he ran for the Senate. He wanted him to be Postmaster General. At that point, a friend of Roosevelt's was Postmaster General, and Roosevelt, "Sure, we'll talk about it when I get back." And Roosevelt died on April 12th. So, and that was it. Truman became president.
And following up on Chris's question, and then maybe we can just to give the full context. The Harry Truman who becomes vice president, he's been a senator for a while, but this is not a guy sort of steeped with national and international experience. He's got some through the leadership of the Truman Committee, but he's probably not the figure that anybody in the United States would have said, well, he's the natural successor to Franklin Roosevelt. And there certainly were other people who were probably regarded as potentially more competent presidents than him when he comes in.
Well, Roosevelt chose him. It was basically a compromise. He was trying to get rid of Henry Wallace, his vice president, who everyone told him to get rid of. Henry Wallace was thought to be perhaps a little bit too sympathetic to the Soviet Union. He was also personally he had strange, not strange ideas, but his beliefs were sort of a mixture of Judaism and Buddhism and Christianity and Zoroastrianism, and so he was considered slightly odd, and he was basically thought, well, he probably should be replaced. And the other person, Roosevelt had promised the job to James Francis Burns, who had been a senator and from South Carolina. He'd been a congressman, and actually had recently worked as what they called Roosevelt's assistant president. Roosevelt basically said, "I want you to take over the domestic responsibilities." Burns is a great figure, a fascinating figure. Burns never finished. Well, he never really finished grade school, but Roosevelt put him on the Supreme Court. Where Burns he never left a serious mark there, and he was bored by the court, and then he went to work for. Roosevelt had promised Burns the job of vice president on the grounds that he knew so much. He helped run the domestic side of the government, but Burns had real problems. The African Americans hated him because he was a real Ku Klux, not a Ku Kluxer, but he was against the anti-lynching laws, and he was a rabid segregationist. So he said, well, that was not good, and labor didn't trust him at all. So they ended up this compromise candidate, this Missouri senator who offended nobody. And as you say, Truman had already made a mark as what became chairman of what became called the Truman Committee, and that was basically, it was a committee that Truman himself started. Truman got it started, and it was to go after waste, fraud, and abuse. And that was in the defense industries. And that began before the war, and it continued. And it was very successful. Truman was on the cover of Time magazine as someone who had saved the nation millions of dollars. And so he was more than a non-entity when he became president. But he was certainly not a major figure. But there was really no one else who was obvious in terms of the politics of the day, and in terms of Roosevelt's advisors.
And I think that Jimmy Burns. This is a comment, Chris. I'm going to let you have the question, but I think that Jimmy Burns is one of the. I mean, here's a guy who in a slightly different set of circumstances, could have been the president who presided over those 8 years. Instead, he's somebody that most of the people in our audience are leaping to Google if they want to know anything about him, because they've not heard his name before or barely remember who he might be. So that's how that one little decision there, changes the trajectory, because he's later Secretary of State. I mean, he does a lot of things, but he's basically unknown today.
Yeah, he's definitely worth Googling. And
after the show, don't go away now.
He was Secretary of State, but that was sort of Truman feeling guilty that he'd been cheated out of being, that he hadn't become president, and so it was sort of and he had also Truman had as I say, Truman was going to at one point Truman was going to nominate him for the presidency in the 1944 convention. So no, yes. So yeah, Jimmy Burns, fascinating guy, and became a very bitter guy. And he turned against Roosevelt later, obviously, because Roosevelt thought Roosevelt had lied to him. He said privately he would gut anyone who would help him. And then in 1952, this good Democrat, he endorsed Eisenhower against Stevenson in 52. Mm. So anyway, it was about it. Back to the atom bomb. No, so back to the atom bomb. So, by the way, there was when I say it was preordained, there was the interim committee, which was sort of a non-name for a committee, basically said we're going to go ahead with this thing, and there was no debate. No one questioned the idea we were going to go ahead with. This was before Roosevelt died, and then there was the Target Committee, and I mentioned earlier, Kyoto was the first city on the list, and then people told Truman, don't do it. The city of shrines and pet temples and with no military value, don't do it. And Truman didn't do it.
Well, now, Jeff, one of the things that I'm interested in, but how much of the end of the war and how the war ends is Truman? I mean, is his imprint on this, not only in the Pacific, obviously with the bomb, but also in Europe with Germany, the war against Germany. Does he actually have an impact on the result? Does it look a certain way because of his involvement, or is he, kind of just playing the cards, winding it down, and then he kind of goes and turns into his own man?
Well, I mean, there's still that's still being discussed, or still being. I mean, even today. I mean, the decision what happened after the war in Europe? I mean, the division of Germany was that possibly could have gone another way, but there was no way. I thought. I mean, it seems from what Eisenhower and others suggested that we were going to fight the Russians again. But that created real problems in Europe, and as far as the war in Japan goes, yeah, there was debate about that too. Truman never questioned it, but people like George Marshall persuaded him that perhaps 500,000 lives would be saved by avoiding a land invasion and dropping this bomb. And Truman believed it. There was a wonderful idea that fascinated me. I put it as a footnote because I couldn't get it into the text. There was no really, but Lewis Strauss, who is became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission later on, he had this idea that we could pick this forest of cryptomerias, these gigantic cedar trees, and we would evacuate everybody. This would be a demonstration of the bomb's power, and then we would drop the bomb. Then these trees would lie down like a great circle of. And it would just terrify the Japanese, and they would instantly surrender if this happened. Of course, that never happened. There was never a demonstration of the bomb, and the demonstration of the bomb was Hiroshima. As I said, Truman gave the order. By the way, I don't know who. I'm not quite sure who gave the order to drop the bomb on Nagasaki. It seemed to be sort of in motion anyway. So that's another question. History has to resolve still.
It struck me reading your book, we're talking about the atomic bomb. There's a lot of foreign policy that obviously comes into play in this post-war period. That under Truman, we really see the creation of kind of the world order that holds fast for many decades, really well into the 21st century, that now in some ways seems to be disintegrating, or at least suffering some serious wear and tear. Also under his presidency, that the Cold War begins, and in fact we go to war in kind of one of the first of our undeclared wars, undeclared wars since World War II. How do you evaluate his foreign policy, kind of overall, how did he do? What was his successes and what were his failures?
Well, you're skipping through a lot of history. I mean,
Sorry.
no. We all do. I do the same. I do the same thing. But I would say the most important piece of his foreign policy was what became known as the Marshall Plan. It was this revolutionary idea that we were going to use the enormous wealth this country had. There was nothing like it to rebuild Europe, which had been devastated by the war in ways we can't imagine. And furthermore, it turned out we were also going to rebuild our defeated enemy. Germany was going to get rebuilt too before this was all. That wasn't part of the Marshall Plan, but the Marshall Plan was extraordinary thing, because as I said, it was generous and it was far-reaching, and it was also a lot of self-interest for us. We were going to we wanted a strong self-sustaining Europe too, and so that was very important. The other really important thing came in the second term, which was the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that was and Truman, when Truman announced it, he sort of said, well, we should think of this sort of like a neighborhood watch group where friends looking out for each other, and it was a very different kind of NATO than the one we have today. I can't today. I don't know how many people or how many nations are part of NATO today, but then it really was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and Britain and France and the Scandinavian countries and so on, and that was that worked. That was to hold back the Soviet Union, Soviet advances, and the Soviet and what was seen as sort of potential Soviet aggression. So that was important. And then there was the Truman Doctrine, which became, and that has become, we don't yet know whether that was a good or bad policy. It was probably good in the sense that it probably was effective in stopping Soviet aggression, but it's not clear that it was even necessary. And what some people saw was it was just going to give carte blanche to sort of unending policies to stop what seemed to be Soviet aggression. And it was, we're going to be in a series of unending wars that don't really affect us and so on. And that may have led to that sort of thing may have led to the Korean War, which was in the middle of his second term, and which I consider the sort of the most disastrous policy.
And just to clarify, the Truman Doctrine is the idea that we're going to support any people who are being subjugated by a hostile minority or outside powers, essentially.
Yeah. It wasn't clear it wasn't going to be anyone, because he was instantly challenged only by Senator Robert Taft, who was sort of an isolationist. But what it was, he was told, the British ambassador told Acheson, or Burr Acheson, that this was actually Burns was Secretary of State, but Acheson was his deputy, that they were going to stop giving aid to Greece and Turkey. And suddenly, that was again the abdication of the British Empire of its responsibilities, of its commitments. And so Acheson and Marshall, General George Marshall, went to see Truman and said, we really need to do something about this. And that led to the Truman Doctrine was basically an effort to get Congress to approve $400 million to give aid to Greece and Turkey. No military aid, but just to sort of give them, to sort of bulk them up so that they could resist what was going to be seen as possible communist aggression. And Acheson saw this. He said it was he sort of saw the Soviets like a rotten apple, affecting all the vegetables around Europe. I'm being silly, but he really saw the Russians and the Soviet Union as a real danger to Western interests, and of course at the time he was right, but the question about the Truman Doctrine was how far does it go? Who do we defend? How many nations do we defend? How deep can our commitments go? How deep are our pocketbooks, and how deep is our military ability to step in?
So okay, so I want to pick up on that a bit, Jeffrey, because as people who watch the show know, I live here in the UK, and I'm really interested in the relationships between the two countries and their history together and what have you. And I was fascinated in the book by that discussion of the British saying, we're not going to keep funding Greece and Turkey. We can't, and the baton being passed. And what I'm curious about, or I'd like to know more about, is, what was the reaction of the administration? Are they aware that whether you like it or not, it's your job now. And kind of, were they aware that this transition was happening? And if so, what was their reaction to it? Did they want to take on this mantle, or did they just like, okay, well, I guess it's us, or,
Yeah, I think I say Atchison and Marshall, John Marshall, certainly understood what was happening. They would certainly understand that. I don't want to use the cliche, but yeah, that the baton had been passed to a new generation, and the Americans were suddenly a world power. They had world power responsibilities. Whether they wanted it or not is another question, but they were stuck with it. And the question was, and should they or should they not have asked for aid? Probably they should have at the time, but how far was it going to go? That was unsettled, but there certainly was a real awareness of it, and right away, I mean, the serious colonists and so on were writing. This was Truman had suddenly himself got bigger in their estimation. He was this man who was seen as a little unprepared man, and suddenly became an historical figure by doing this. This was a major step forward in the presidency, in his presidency, and so he really put his stamp on the presidency that was a year before the Marshall Plan was proposed. That was in March, so that was a big deal and a big change in the outlook of this country.
Absolutely, yeah.
Want to remind everybody that we are talking today to Jeffrey Frank, who is the author of The Trials of Harry S. Truman, not The Trial of Harry S. Truman, which would be some sort of really different book, but this is not that. The Trials of Harry S. Truman. If you have a question about some aspect of Truman's presidency, please bring it on, because there's lots that happened during those almost 8 years, and there's no way we're going to be able to cover them all today. Let's talk about Korea a little bit. You said it was the biggest disaster of Truman's presidency. It certainly is kind of a war. It was the first sort of war that we fought to a not victory, right? To a war without victory. There would be others to follow. It also involved a conflict between Harry S. Truman and Douglas MacArthur, who was the supreme commander in the Far East. And one of the things I was thinking about, obviously MacArthur is such a bigger than life figure in American history, and there really has never been another general like Douglas MacArthur who kind of intimidated everybody. The president, the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, reporters, everybody except maybe the Chinese, who seem to be very unintimidated by him. But talk about how do things kind of, you said it was you used the word disaster or disastrous for this. Why is it a disaster for Truman? Where does he go wrong? What could he do better? Big question. I know. Take a little time if you need it.
Yeah, no. Let me start. I mean, when at the end of June 1950, the North Korea invaded the South. That was the idea. The goal of the North was to unify Korea under the Kim regime, and Truman's reaction was to, encouraged by others, was to resist this, and he was urged by people like John Foster Dulles and outsiders, and Atchison, particularly Atchison, we have to stop us. And Truman himself saw this as a real test of this new United Nations to stop aggression and so on. And I think it was the right decision. When I say it was a disaster, what I'm saying is that the war, and then there was a commitment of American troops, by the way, who were completely unprepared. There was sort of a slaughter of Americans at first, and the war there was a very successful and sort of brilliant military maneuver by MacArthur in September of 1950. That was just a few months after the war, and the war then turned around. At one point, the North controlled 90% of the South, and 90% of Korea. I'm sorry, and then Truman. MacArthur had this was a huge success, the Incheon invasion, the Incheon landing, and then the war turned around. The war turned around and became victory was in sight. And then MacArthur got the idea, well, we could perhaps unify Korea under our terms. And then the war became bigger and more difficult and broader and hopeless. I began to think of it in terms of our Gulf War. The first Gulf War was, you can say, was a great success. We managed to do what we set out to do. We managed to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. That was a success, and then it ended. And then the second Gulf War was not so successful. Then we decided we would have regime change. The Korean War could have ended after Incheon. Then we had basically pushed the North out of the South. The dividing line of Korea was the 38th parallel. It was sort of an arbitrary dividing line that was set after the war. And if we had pushed, the idea was to push the North past north of the 38th parallel, and that was basically had been achieved after the Incheon landing. But then it didn't end, and then it became Gulf War II, and it ended up being with 37,000 Americans dead, countless numbers of Koreans, perhaps more than 1 million Chinese. The complete destruction of the North. We basically, under MacArthur's order, we burned every single town and village in the North, and that may be one of the reasons why the Kim family is sort of anti-American even today. That's sort of embedded in their memory. And when the war ended, Eisenhower got the final terms were signed in July of 1953. Nothing had changed. The same borders, except that the North had picked up one city that they hadn't had before. And and the war still hasn't ended. There was basically a ceasefire that continues today. So that was an extraordinary cost, and for what? If we had the war, we don't know what would have happened if we had ended the war. I mean, if we had gotten peace terms in September 1950, but I think you can make a good case. And many people think the Chinese would not have come in. I'm racing ahead, by the way. After Incheon, and then as MacArthur pushed north, then the war completely changed. Then the Chinese sent their, as they call it, human waves into the south, and then it became a sort of a great bloody rout of the Allied forces, and that was it became a stalemate. There was with no end in sight, and then it ended with no end in sight.
Well, kind of picking up on that, and I know your biography is about Truman and his presidency, but kind of a larger question. In the book, you talk about General Ridgway asking a question in relation to MacArthur, and he says, "I've always asked, I just can't understand how such a damn fool could have gotten to be a general." So I'm going to ask the same. So I'll ask you the same question. How did Truman and Marshall and these people kind of not? I mean, I know eventually, obviously, Truman does lower the boom on MacArthur, but how was he able to continue for as long as he does? And what was Truman's kind of view on him?
Well, Truman, initially, if you look at Truman's diaries and so on, even before the Korean War, he thought MacArthur was kind of a phony, kind of a bunco artist and so on. And he said, why can't we have people like Eisenhower and Marshall? But he was as you say, he was a huge personage. People were intimidated by him. Ridgway, who eventually saw through him, was intimidated by him. Marshall was reluctant to try to make him stop when MacArthur began to see that the war was our war to win now, and it was our duty to reunify Korea. No one stopped him, and it was only, I mean, he lasted until April of 1951, when he basically when Truman said, when they were trying to get a peace agreement with the North finally, and told MacArthur stop fighting for a while, and MacArthur said no, basically, and that was such a disobeying a president's order was and so Truman got the Joint Chiefs to go, and they did go pretty quickly.
There is no, don't be sorry.
It became a huge outcry briefly. There was lots of Truman should be impeached, lots of things, and so and then MacArthur gave a speech before Congress, which he came home. He hadn't been home for years. He hadn't been home since the 30s, and a speech that ended with the words, "Old soldiers never die; they just fade away." And people were crying. It was such an extraordinary speech. And one congressman said, "It was I saw the voice of God today." But then MacArthur began to fade away. He really did begin to fade away, and people began to realize, well, it's the civilian control of the military is an important thing, and that's what Truman stood up for that too.
There's a great quote in your book from General Matthew Ridgway, who of course, eventually comes in to command the Eighth Army, and is a person who kind of, after the Chinese communists have come in, the Chi-Coms, as they were called, and have pushed the Americans again back down, and it's kind of disastrous, and Ridgway comes in. But before he comes in, he's in the Pentagon, and he says, after a meeting, he says to a commanding officer, well, why can't you just order MacArthur what to do? Why? And it's like you could just give him a direct order. He's in the chain of command, and nobody can really has an answer to that. It's like wait a minute, just give MacArthur an order. We can't do that. He's too hallowed. I mean, again, he takes up so much headspace in everybody's brain in that time. It seems kind of shocking, because the only general in American history who I can think of sort of who did that briefly, for a year or two, was General McCullough in the Civil War. But even he, I don't think to the degree had that sort of towering image that MacArthur had.
No, it's hard to understand. For me, as I say, and some people saw through him. We quoted Eisenhower. How did such a damn fool ever become a general? Truman calling him a bunk artist, but he had this aura. I mean, I'm not going to use the word charisma, but he was. Yeah, some people really did see him as bigger than life. Truman was reading a lot of. Truman, who was a big Civil War buff, was reading a lot about McClellan being fired before he fired MacArthur. He was very much interested in history, and so he saw. He actually saw this precedent. I mean, that made it easier for him to do it. But yeah.
Well, one of the things, speaking of
McCullough did not have the sort of stature, deserved or not, that MacArthur had.
Well, and speaking of him being interested in history, you say they had a very personal view of history, and I was just curious, what did you mean by that, and how do you think that kind of impacted his view of the world, his policies, how he managed the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I read some of it's sort of hard to follow. If you read some of Truman's letters and diaries, he read a lot of history. He would write about the Peloponnesian War and he would find these parallels that people not always understand. But he understood it, and he meant it. And I quote a lot of them in the book. He got into right in the middle of the Korean War, when he should have been completely focused on it, but he would relax sometimes. And he got into a correspondence with a newspaper friend of his who known in Missouri, and there again they were talking about some battles in Greece in the 2nd century, and they're going back and forth debating this. And that's Truman for you. When he was a kid, his mother gave him this set of books of great men and famous women, which he devoured, and he had these set of heroes, everyone from the King of Sweden to Robert E. Lee, and that was Truman, who was he was very much autodidact, but he was a serious reader. He claimed to have read everything in the Independence Public Library. I don't believe it, but I'm sure he read a lot, and that was Truman. But he would say I was a little baffled by it, and some people who read his stuff are a little baffled by some of his historical parallels, but he was very serious about them.
We have a few. Yeah. Listen, we'd love to have him on the show if he was around to chat about the Peloponnesian War or anything else. But that's probably
he'd be a great guest. He would.
And he could have some bourbon and branch water.
He would, and he'd probably say a few things that would offend your viewers, but that's Truman too.
We might just do it ourselves. So we have a few questions from the audience, and it might take us over some ground we've already covered, but we want to try to bring them in to the degree we can. And we have a few questions about the atomic bomb, and I'll pick this one as kind of a representative one. What is known about Truman's reaction to the revelation to him of the existence of the bomb and the plans for the bomb? And someone else asked, were people really able to convey to him accurately the power of the bomb? Did he really understand, what this was about, kind of where it was going, and what was his reaction to it?
Yeah, I think he understood it as much as anyone could understand it. It had never been used, and no one knew how much damage it would do. The scientists probably knew. He was thrilled He was thrilled when the bomb was first tested on July 16th. He was in Potsdam meeting with Truman, with Churchill and Stalin, and when he got a report that this was successful, it was the bomb. The first report said a blind woman saw it. I mean, this was how. I mean, who knows whether that was whether the light was that strong, but it was. He was thrilled, and he saw this was going to end the war. This was his final ace. I mean, he was a poker player. This was his whole card, and he was when he told Churchill, someone described him as, and Churchill knew about it, of course. Someone described Truman and Churchill's demeanor like two boys hiding apples in their pocket. They were so happy. So Truman saw this as a way to end the war fast, and he loved it. He was thrilled by it. And when the word came in that this thing had been dropped on Hiroshima, he was on a ship crossing the ocean, and he walked around and talked to the servicemen and others. He said, "This is the greatest thing in history," and he was thrilled. And he wasn't thinking at that point of the damage it would cause. He was trying to end a war against a hated enemy. And that was the only thing on his mind at first. He began to have, he never had second thoughts, or at least he never admitted second thoughts, but that was his first reaction to it.
Yeah. But I mean, kind of picking up on that, Jeffrey, you talk about in the book that decision, even though he was comfortable with it, it did still kind of overshadow a lot of the rest of his presidency. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how the after effects of that or having that power kind of sat with him. It wasn't as simple as, I had to do it and I did it and that's fine.
No, I mean, not. I mean, that's such an interesting question for me too. It affected our foreign policy. I mean, until the fall of 1949, we were the sole nuclear power. So everything we said and did, that was always in the background. And it was sort of, at one point I sort of suggested that it was sort of like the gravitational pull of the sun or of a great star in the solar system. That was the bomb. We had it. No one else had it. And it's unclear how powerful it was in terms of our foreign policy. But we never really gave an ultimatum to the Russians when there was, as you know, there was a moment when the Russians were threatening to blockade Berlin. And our reaction to it was to fly supplies. And I suppose we could have threatened to use this weapon. We never did. We never threatened to use it. There were hints at the end of the Korean War that we might have used it. It's not clear that we would have, but no, it was this unused weapon that was never been used after it was used twice in Japan, and it was always there. And even when the Russians got the bomb in 1949, we were still the superior power, even though we were the Cold War was on, but that was a huge thing, and it didn't change until suddenly everyone began to get nuclear bombs, and which is of course which is the situation today. Who knows who's going to use it when, where? We hope never. But
bringing in another audience question. We get a question. Can you speak about Truman's view on the creation of Israel? Because obviously that happens during his presidency, and there is at least de facto recognition of Israel pretty quickly. But that follows a pretty intense cabinet debate in which a guy who is somebody who Truman often wants to follow, George Marshall, and this is a case where he doesn't.
Yes, in fact, George Marshall told one of his biographers, Forrest Pogue, that you can find the interviews on your fast. He actually said, "I could get him to do anything. I get Truman to do anything," and other people who watched them thought that was true, but it wasn't true in the case of Israel. MacArthur and George Marshall and Secretary of State Acheson was, and James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of Defense, said, "Don't do it. This is going to alter the balance of the Middle East. We can't put ourselves in this position." And so Truman went against all their advice, and I think it was in many ways a sentimental decision. I think he was affected by the pictures of the stories of refugees after the war, of the Jewish refugees from the concentration camps from Poland, and and elsewhere. And I think so that was part of it. Also, he had a friend, Eddie Jacobson, a childhood friend basically, and who had been a friend during the war, who was from Independence, and with whom he went into business. They started the Truman and Jacobson haberdashery shop in Kansas City. It did not do well when it went under. And Jacobson told him to meet Chaim Weizmann, the incoming president of Israel. Truman referred to it as Chaim Weizmann. He couldn't quite pronounce the Chaim, and Truman did it. It was a sentimental decision, if anything, and it was Truman. There was one point where Truman said to somebody, I think it was a newspaper, maybe it was Arthur Kroc of the Times. So there are two people that sit at this desk. There's the president of the United States and there's Harry Truman. And when it came to Israel, that was Harry Truman's decision, not the president's. If you can make that distinction.
So, I apologize, Jeffrey, we have questions all over the board here, but we have so many questions and it's such a wide range of topics that I'd like to.
Jeffrey can handle it. You can handle it.
I hope I can answer.
You're like at the dartboard, and we're going to throw the darts at you.
Hope it's nothing difficult, please. Okay.
No. So this next question is from Wally, and I want to tie it into. He asks, what made Truman desegregate the military in 1948? And I'd like to kind of build on that and say, if you ask you to talk a little bit about, Truman's attitude on race and some of the decisions he makes, because in the book you say, that he comes from a background, he was interested in the Confederacy, he had Confederate roots or Confederate connections that he was very proud of, but he's making some pretty substantial decisions around race and civil rights. And so maybe using the military as an example, just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, I don't know whether to start forward or backward. I should start forward. When it came to race, Truman was a man, and he was at war with himself. He really was. You mentioned his Confederate roots, his family, and he grew up, and he was not a great civil rights advocate for a long time. He gave a speech in 1940 in which he basically said, "I'm not in favor of social equality for the Negro. I want them to have a chance to succeed." But he said, the Negro himself knows that there's never going to be equality between the races. And this was true in 1940. And then he evolved, maybe not inwardly, but outwardly he did. And then he spoke at the Lincoln Memorial to the NAACP. I should also say, by the way, he was a man who used the N-word all the time. He even after he was president in private, and he had no, and it wasn't even with anger. He just did it because that was his background. That's the way he spoke. But he really wanted to. In 1947, he really realized that something should be done. He was really affected. There was a horrific case in the South where a man named Isaac Woodard, who was returning from the war, was intentionally blinded by I think it was a sheriff or a constable or something. He was intentionally blinded, and when he dared to sort of ask if he could use the men's room, and it was a horrible case, and it became so. And Truman was deeply affected by it. It really troubled him. And then there were lynchings and things in the South. There were beatings in the South, and that got to him. And he realized something needs to be done. And I mentioned earlier that this idea that there was the president and there was Harry Truman. And again, this was the president speaking. He knew that a president needed to do something more than just sort of mouth off about this is bad. He had to do something about it. And then he gave a speech at the Lincoln Memorial, and people, including Eleanor Roosevelt, sort of these enemies of the South, Eleanor Roosevelt, Justice Black, and Walter White, who was the president of the NAACP, and he really came forward and said, we need to do more. And he appointed a committee, and they came with proposals such as ending segregation on interstate trains. He wanted other things so much so that Strom Thurmond, who was the governor of South Carolina, said, he's basically declared war on the South, and this led to the walkout of the South in 1948. But he gave the order in 1948 to desegregate the military. The military was not desegregated until Eisenhower became president. It wasn't implemented then, but that was also part and parcel of it. And Truman understood that he had lost the South in the 1948 campaign, and he really thought that he needed to do something else. When he made this speech at the Lincoln Memorial, when it was all over, and he said, I want every person to have every opportunity, every opportunity that a person can have in this country. Walter White went up to it and said that was wonderful. And Truman said, I wouldn't have said it unless I meant it. And Truman at the time did mean it. I mean, he really meant it, and he felt it. And even though he was never going to be, he was never going to be an integrationist, in fact, never, not even close. Later on, when he was post-presidential, he was against the sit-ins in the South. He thought, you're not going to force me to integrate, open my lunch counter. But he wanted to do the right thing as president, and he did, and that was the desegregation of the military, and that was that order came, and the legislation to open things up much more than they had been, and there'd been nothing quite like it. I mean, there'd never been a real push to sort of desegregate the country, which Truman had basically started doing.
Jeffrey, I want to make a little side trip here into your research efforts, because there was something that I was quite fascinated by, and it goes back to the Korea and MacArthur part of the story, as Truman is learning about what MacArthur is saying and doing and getting angry about it. And you actually made a Freedom of Information request to the National Security Agency to see some intercepts. The NSA listens in, as we all know. Hey, hello, NSA, if you're there. And some intercepts that provided Truman with information on what MacArthur was saying. These were intercepts from a Chilean diplomat. And so, these had been talked about by some State Department officials. So you knew they existed. You made a Freedom of Information request. These are documents from 72 years ago.
Yes.
Several years ago. And your request was denied.
Yeah, so was my appeal denied. I'm still angry about it. It's preposterous.
Well, so what do you think's going on there?
I don't know. I think maybe because of that period, because our situation, our relations with Korea were so fraught. Our contemporary relations were. I don't know, but it's baffled me, and it baffled. At one point, I got an email from someone at the NSA. It was sort of hinting, well, it looks, we're close to getting it, and then suddenly, no, the door shut on me. Yeah, it still annoys me. I can't. I don't. When I was researching another book on Eisenhower and Nixon, there was some very sensitive questions about close to whether it was close to war in the Far East, and that was declassified almost on the spot. It took a couple of weeks. This wasn't. This Korean stuff wasn't. Yeah, very, very annoying.
Very weird, I mean,
I think we know the truth, but I think we know the truth. And it was MacArthur sort of bragging. He wants to get China in the war so he can finish them off. MacArthur had sort of great plans of sort of having a nuclear finis with the Chinese, and that obviously never happened. But, MacArthur was a very dangerous man.
Yes, but kind of like picking up on maybe something that Rick was starting on. What made you decide there needs to be a new book on Truman? What was it that kind of nagged on you that said, I'm going to dive into this guy? What did you think hadn't been told about him?
So it's sort of personal. I mean, in some ways, I love the period. I'd already been there with us with my book Ike and Dick, which dealt with the with the 50s. Actually, it was started with the 40s because there was a sort of and so I sort of the Truman was kind of a prequel to that and so on. It's also personal in the sense that I grew. My father worked at the Pentagon. He in the Department of the Army. He was a civilian. He had polio as a boy and couldn't serve, but he came down to Washington because he wanted to work. He wanted to do his part too, and so I grew up with the idea that. The Pentagon was part of my life, and that period fascinates me. Our entire modern world was sort of formed there. It's you could say it's sort of deforming right now with all that's going on. But parts of it. It's still in many ways intact. NATO is sort of intact, though it's kind of frayed at the edges. I mean, I don't think Truman would have imagined a sort of right-wing Hungary as part of his NATO alliance, but so the Marshall Plan, that paradigm that is still we still are trying to help nations that need help, but then I got into it also. As you mentioned, the Korean War, that was our first war of that sort, and not the last. It was a war. It's fascinating because it was a war that we learned nothing from. We learned nothing from it. Korea, Vietnam happened, nothing learned. Middle East, nothing learned. And I don't understand. That baffles me too, and that fascinates me too.
I'm struck as following up on Chris's question a little bit as you talk here. You've written about Eisenhower, you've written about Truman. It's kind of a shame that these two guys end up being pretty bitter enemies, to the degree that when Eisenhower is elected president, they don't even talk. Basically, on the car ride from the White House to the inaugural, they had been allies earlier. They have a lot in common. What goes wrong between Eisenhower and Truman? What do you think's going on there?
By the way, that photo of Eisenhower and Truman shaking hands, a photographer sort of made them do it, and then he got the snap, and then he got it out. But it was a very tense moment. It really was. Truman really admired Eisenhower. He really did. He actually offered. They had a conversation in Germany when Truman went over in Potsdam, and Eisenhower was basically said, "I'll do anything I can for you, including helping you become president." And Truman meant it at the time. I think, that never really changed. When Eisenhower was thinking about running for president, Truman basically said, "Don't do it. You're gonna hate politics." But he really admired him. Eisenhower also admired Truman. He wasn't a great admirer of him. He didn't think maybe he was big enough for the job, but he certainly liked him, and he thought he was a man of real integrity and so on. What happened was the 1952 campaign politics. It was a really horrible time for Eisenhower. Wasn't used to ever being criticized. He was a 5-star general, and in the campaign, there was one moment in particular which is pretty famous, where General Marshall had been attacked by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who had been using anti-communism as a sort of great spiel, and he accused MacArthur of being a traitor of all traitors.
Accused Marshall, right? Accused Marshall.
He called General Marshall, right? Days will live in infamy of what he had done. And I'm sorry, I'm quoting the Pearl Harbor, but and Truman was really offended by this, and he thought, and Eisenhower was going to speak up for him, and in Wisconsin during a stop, and he didn't. And the reason Truman knew about this was because his speech had been printed in the Times, and Truman saw this as an act of political cowardice. You don't turn on a man who has helped him. MacArthur had been his mentor. General Marshall had been Eisenhower's mentor. He had helped him. He supported him. He was his friend. And Truman said, "You don't turn on your friends. You don't it's an act of." He called Eisenhower a coward, and that's something that Eisenhower could never forgive, and it never went away. They spoke later on after Kennedy's funeral. They spoke, had coffee together, but it was never going to be the same. And that was what happened. It was sort of an irreparable breach from the 52 campaign.
So Jeffrey, now that you've written the book, or in the process of writing a book, at the end of it, what did you, I guess, learn about Truman, or what surprised you most by the end of it that you didn't know before?
Yeah, I think what I came away with was realizing that he was. I began to realize how important he was in terms of he was honorable. He stood for. I came away realizing how rare it is, or how rare it has become, to someone who really worships the Constitution, worships our history. And Truman was a man, as I say, who really loved his country and I came away from really appreciating his. I've also came to appreciate his personal loyalties. I've never seen, I don't know if I had a president that was such a devoted family man. It's the idea that he ever might have cheated on his wife, Bess. It's impossible to imagine. He was devoted to his wife, to his daughter, Margaret. He was devoted, and he was loyal to his friends. Some of them were not, some of them probably didn't deserve the loyalty that he gave them. Some of them were slightly disreputable, but he didn't waver. He stood by his friends. And he stood, and so he was, I came away feel that, and I came away realize he is someone who really really grew, and as they say, this grew in the job. He didn't. Then he stopped learning. And when he left the presidency, he never changed after that. And he asked about the bomb. I will do it today. I'll never regret it. He never had second thoughts after he left the White House. But while he was there, he was a man who kept learning and growing, and I appreciated that.
So Jeffrey Frank, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about Harry Truman and your book. That's the wrong title. That's the next week's one. Let's try getting the right one up there. The Trials of Harry S. Truman. Your very fascinating book about President Truman, and lots of interesting stuff in there. And we do appreciate your joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. Chris.
Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Really
Farewell. And Chris, before we go today or talk about next week, I want to, if I can manage the technical aspects here of sharing the screen. This is always a frightening moment in history, but we have here. We'll put it up full screen. We our new tour that you and I are going to lead together for the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington is now up on the Stephen Ambrose Tours website. So you can find it there. You can read about it. You can sign up for it and reserve a spot. You know, Chris, I think when the world discovers that the two hosts of History Happy Hour will be on the road together in what will undoubtedly be one of the great buddy comedies of the
They're going to be busy
century.
Watching the grass grow, yes.
Yeah, those seats will fill up. They probably will. So I encourage people to reserve your place now. I know some of you have done so already. Thank you so much. We're excited to see you. And so that should be a fun trip. It's a couple of years away, but I think it will reserve early. So we will keep mentioning it from time to time. And hope you'll join us there. Chris, I flashed the title on, but what do we have coming up next week?
Yeah, I'm very excited about next week. So Richard Overy, who is one of my absolute favorite historians, came out recently with a book, Blood and Ruins, which is a really new and refreshing look at World War II and what brings the war on and how it's fought. He has some really incredible insights. So, I'm really thrilled to have him on the show. And I'm a little bit of I'm going to geek out a bit and a little starstruck by our guest. So make sure you join us for a new look at World War II.
I think this is one of those 800-page books, isn't it? It's
800
a lot of reading
easy, wonderful pages to read, full of fascinating insights. But I do want to thank Jeffrey for not having an 800-page book. I enjoyed Jeffrey's book, but
oh yeah, it was good. It was good. It has plenty of pages. We just want to say, but it's just not 800 of them. And of course, we want to thank Cheryl Del Pozo for booking the interview with Jeffrey Frank and for handling the tech run through on Friday, and for all the help that she's given us. And thank everybody for joining us today, and for being with us. Keep living and learning, everybody.
There we go. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.